wherever I was. So yeah, so I decided to go back to school. So I went to UBC and I studied Indigenous studies and gender studies. And it was while I was in university that I was able to, first of all, um, be exposed to this like beautiful archive of films by Indigenous filmmakers that is so often like inaccessible to the public.
Mm.
And it was during this time that I was kind of like awakened to the fact that there are so many talented Indigenous filmmakers and have been for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And in my last year of my undergrad, our chief and council essentially leased half of our tribal lands. Our reserve is the largest in Canada. They leased that land to Gas and Oil without consulting with our tribal membership. And being so far away from home, and knowing that our territory was at risk of just basically being destroyed by hydraulic fracturing or fracking, I didn't really know what to do, but I took one film class at UBC and decided for that class that I would make kind of this like experimental art film about hydraulic fracturing and the damage that it would do to the land. And it wasn't a very good film that I made, but that experience is what kind of like propelled me to continue making films. It was the opportunity like to finally have agency and power, and control over the way that I wanted to be represented, and to tell a story that came from a place of authenticity.
Mm.
It was such a profound and transformative experience. So after making that film is when I decided I needed to continue making films. But while I was at UBC in the Indigenous Studies program, there's a lot of thought and effort put into the ethics of working with Indigenous communities.
Mm.
And that comes from like a research perspective, and an academic perspective. But it was a wonderful opportunity to really think through the ethics of working with marginalized communities, and in particular working with Indigenous communities, and recognizing that there is this like history of extractive and damaging forms of research that have happened with Indigenous communities, and I think the same exists for film. Um, and so, yeah, I guess I've been making films for 9 years now,
Mhm.
um, and it's been an incredible learning process. Every project that I've made um, has been just an exercise in gaining knowledge on how to make films.
Mhm.
I haven't really gone to film school. It's something I would like to do, but I've kind of just like learned through the process of doing. Um, so I guess there's two particular projects that I kind of wanted to talk about, in terms of process, and representation, and the ethics of telling stories that don't sort of replicate this like history of extractive forms of filmmaking. Um, yeah, so let's see. There's this incredible article that I read this week that came out in Medium, by Sonia Childress. Did you get a chance to read it?
No.
It's so great. Everybody that's watching, you should go and read this article if you haven't. It's called A Reckoning. The documentary film industry must chart a new path forward. But there were a few passages in this article that I just found so profound and so valuable that I kind of wanted to just quickly read it here to maybe
Mhm.
set the tone before going into talking about my own projects. Um, so the article essentially is about the documentary film industry,
Mhm.
and all of the many forms of misrepresentation and disempowerment, and I guess like theft of story and lack of like accountability and authorship that happens within that industry, and has happened for a very long time, largely due to the industry being dominated by white voices. And yeah, so anyway, there's a couple like really beautiful passages. Okay, so self-representation is about agency, power, healing, and a cultural corrective. When filmmakers of color tell their own stories about sweeping historical events or intimate personal dramas, they're engaging in acts of narrative justice. This work is not just about intellectual curiosity, it's about centering the humanity of those who are otherwise rendered invisible or unhuman. It is about countering narratives that allow our communities to be over-policed, over-incarcerated, deported, underfunded, undereducated, and terrorized. Telling one's own story is understood as an urgent cultural intervention. For many BIPOC makers, accountability to those documented and a vision of filmmaking is a tool of justice and liberation. We're embedded into the as a tool of justice and liberation are embedded into the DNA of the filmmaking process. This drastic difference in approach and orientation to filmmaking accounts for much of the anger we see play out at festivals and screenings. So yeah, I think that's just such a powerful statement about the difference in terms of where BIPOC filmmakers are coming from, and also just filmmakers from marginalized communities, those who are living with disabilities, LGBTQ, 2S folks, people who come from marginalized communities, essentially. It's like we're dealing with this added level of pressure and a need for accountability within our communities. And yeah, so I guess I'll talk about two projects that have been wonderful teaching tools, and I think ways to change the way that we work, because this industry, you know, was founded by white men with a very sort of toxic hierarchical approach to making film, and with a very fetishistic gaze towards BIPOC people.
Everyone?
Yeah, everyone that isn't a white man, basically.
Yeah.
A straight white man.
Yeah.
So I've been working on this documentary for the last 4 years about the opioid crisis in my home community of Kainai, or the Blood Reserve in southern Alberta. And fentanyl essentially hit our community like 6 years ago, and we've lost now over 100 people to overdose. And so there essentially isn't anybody in the community who hasn't lost a loved one or who hasn't been personally impacted by the fentanyl crisis. And my mother is a physician on the reserve, so I would hear firsthand from her about all of the just incredibly challenging things that she was witnessing on the front lines of this crisis. And like living in Vancouver and working in film, I was, you know, kind of felt helpless. There wasn't really much that I felt that I could do, which is why I was compelled to make a documentary. But I knew nothing about harm reduction. I had a very basic understanding of addiction. I think for the most part, a lot of people are at that place. There's a lot of kind of like accepted ideas about addiction and forms of treatment and all of that.
Yeah.
And so this process involved so much unlearning, and also like forcing myself to recognize how naive I was about all of this, and to know that coming from that place of naivete and the need to unlearn placed me in a really interesting position in terms of wanting to tell this film, or to tell this story through film. And given that this is my community, these are often family members who I'm working with, there is this intense amount of responsibility and accountability that I have to my community and to my people. And so over the last 4 years, every single time we've gone to shoot has been like this serious exercise in self-reflexivity and self-interrogation of like, you know, why why am I telling this story? Who am I telling it for? And how can I be accountable to the people that I'm working with? And what will be the legacy of this film? You know, how is it going to exist in the archives? Yeah, so it's an NFB co-production, and so to begin with, the National Film Board has this sort of long history of making films about Indigenous people by non-Indigenous filmmakers, and there's so much that exists in their massive archive. And essentially, when you're working with the National Film Board and you're doing a full NFB production or majority NFB production, they own the rights to the material, and it goes into the archives, and that means that, you know, some filmmaker 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road can use that material if the NFB decides to license it. And so I found that really troubling because there were literally hundreds of people from my community who contributed to this film in one way or another. And it really disturbed me to think that their stories and our community's stories would exist within an archive that a government institution owns, and also that other filmmakers in the future, regardless of their intentions, could have the right to license that material. So there was a lot to think about in terms of the legacy and the archives and ownership over those stories. And so one of the first things we did early on was negotiate exactly how ownership would play out. And because it's a co-production, I had you know, grounds to negotiate, and it's still something we're trying to figure out because I'm just one person within my community, and there's 13,000 of us, and I shouldn't be the one who gets to decide necessarily what happens to those stories. So that's an ongoing conversation, trying to figure out, like, how do we ensure that these stories are taken care of in the long term, and how do we ensure that there isn't some sort of like singular ownership of these stories. So that was kind of like one of the first things in this process of like unlearning and figuring out how to engage as an Indigenous person, as a Blackfoot person within my own community, wanting to tell this film within you know, these structural ways of working that are just kind of like norms that are accepted. And so this whole process has been about like dismantling those structures and finding ways to make them work to not only my advantage but to our community's advantage. So yeah, that was one thing that is, you know, it's an ongoing conversation, and I think it's something really important to consider in terms of, you know, archival material and what happens to footage in the long term. What is the legacy of that footage? The second thing that's really important to consider, and I think a lot of filmmakers within the BIPOC community are doing this, is building capacity within our industry, ensuring that there are more of us working behind the camera, because that is ultimately going to influence these narratives. And there's this phrase that a lot of Indigenous filmmakers or people within the community use, which is narrative sovereignty. So this idea of having sovereignty over the narrative, having sovereignty over representation, all of that. And so I think ensuring that we have, you know, if we are the ones driving the narrative, we are the ones crewing the films, working behind the camera, that is a form of narrative sovereignty. And as it stands right now in Canada, there aren't enough Indigenous people working in these key technical positions. And so, you know, I've been wanting to make this film for a very long time. It's been 4 years of work, and it's a feature length film, and it requires a certain amount of skill and expertise, and the number of people in these specific technical positions who are Indigenous, there's just not enough of them in Canada. And so I wanted to make sure that like many other Indigenous filmmakers, I was working towards building capacity. So we made sure that in our key crew positions, we also had not just Indigenous trainees, but people who were working collaboratively with, with the head of these departments. And that looked different every time we went out on a shoot, just depending on people's availability or anything like that. But something that I encountered very early on in development, which has to do with that, was that I was essentially working with settlers on my crew. My DP and my sound guys were white men from southern Alberta, and they're really lovely people. But I think, like many Canadians, there's like so much unlearning and also learning that needs to be done on the part of settlers. And so I brought these crew members into my community, and then witnessed things that were just not okay. And knowing that I was the one leading this project, that I was the one responsible for bringing people who weren't from my community into my community to work with very vulnerable people. And not just vulnerable people, but the process of sharing your story on camera is a very vulnerable position to be in. And so I wanted to use that moment as an opportunity to build a better way of working. And it's very complicated. I think a lot of it's so obvious. A lot of us within the BIPOC community are carry the burden of having to do all of the emotional labor and just the labor of educating settlers on all of the things they just don't know yet.